Our next order of business is to integrate Spring Security with our user and role entities. In general, what we'll need to do is implement the User Details Service interface. If we open this interface in the Spring docs, let me go there now. If we open this interface, we'll see by scrolling down that there is exactly one method to implement, and it's this load by username method. It locates the user based on the username. So when we implement this method, we'll call upon our user DAO, which we haven't written yet, to grab the user entity from the database via Hibernate and use it as the method's return value. Let's start coding our service in DAO now. I'll switch back to IntelliJ, and first I'll create the user service interface. So in my service package, I will create a new, I'll choose Java class, user service, and I'll select interface. There we go. And I'll make this service extend user details service so that my implementation class will need to include that load by username method. And the one additional method that I'll include here is a find by username method, which is a method that's completely for our application purposes and that doesn't have anything to do with Spring Security. So let me add that now. I'll say find by username string username. Let's make sure to import the right user here. Now, this is our user, so if you choose one of the ones up top, you're going to be importing the wrong user. It's the user that comes from com.teamtreehouse, right there. Cool. And that's it for our interface. Let's now create the implementation. So again, in the service package, I'll right-click, new Java class, and I'll call it user service impl. And let me include that service annotation here, as well as indicate that it should be implementing the user service. And in doing so, we'll need to add all unimplemented methods. There should be two. One that comes from that user details service that the user service extends, and one that comes from user service that we explicitly coded in the user service interface. Now, before we dive into this class, we'll first need a way to grab user data from the database. Of course, this will require a DAO for the user entity. Let's go ahead and create that interface in the DAO package. Right-click, new Java class. I'll call it user DAO, and I want this to be an interface. There it is right there. The cool thing here is how little work we have to do. If you recall, we're using Spring Data JPA, so all we have to do here is extend CRUD repository. And when you extend CRUD repository, you tell it the kind of entity that you're after in the database, as well as the class used for the identifier. Again, make sure you are importing the correct user, com.teamtreehouse.todotoday.model.user. And after this, we intelligently code our query methods. In our case, it will suffice to include a find by username method. So let's do that now. Here's how that looks. I want it to return a single user, and we'll say find by username, string username. And finally, let's apply the repository annotation to this interface. And this is to make sure Spring picks this up as a DAO. And now, when we boot the app, Spring Data will generate the implementation of the DAO, so we don't have to code it. That is, it will see a method named find by username, and it includes a string parameter, so it will generate a method that will find a user in the database that has a username column. It uses the method name right here. It has a username column equal to whatever value was passed in. So cool. Okay, back to the user service impl class. We can now auto-wire a user DAO into our service, which we'll need to start combining our user database data, that is, users and roles, so that we can integrate it with Spring Security. So let's auto-wire that up top. Auto-wired, private user DAO, user DAO. Cool. And let me make sure to import that class. There we go. User DAO is imported. The find by username method will be fairly quick here since it only involves calling upon the DAO's method of the same name. So let's return whatever value the DAO returns by calling its method of the same name. As for the load by username method, this one will involve barely more work. Here's what we'll need to do. I'm going to add some comments in here. First, we'll need to load the user from the database. And we'll throw an exception if not found. And then we'll return the user object. So really, we're just doing one extra thing here, and that is that we are throwing an exception if that specific username is not found. And that is expected by the load by username method, which again comes from that user details service interface, which our user interface extended. Let me go back and remind you of that. So the load by username method comes from the user details service interface. Okay, so back to these comments. For loading the user from the database, we'll use the same approach we did in the find by username method. That is, we'll use that user DAO. So let's create a user object and call upon the DAO to find the user by the username. And we'll pass in the username that we received here in this method. Now, because this method should throw the username not found exception, which will be detected by Spring Security if upon authenticating a user is not found with the provided username, then we should do that now if the value that's stored in user at this point happens to be null. So we'll say if the user is null, then we'll throw that exception, username not found exception, and we'll throw a message in there too. User not found. Cool. And let's not forget to return that user object instead of returning null. All finished. So we've finished our service and DAO layers. Next, we'll add some application level configuration to our Spring app that switches on all of our Spring Security functionality.